Thank you everyone for joining us tonight at our event 2020 US elections. What does it all mean? As people are slowly starting to come in, we're going to have an introduction by the US Consul General here at the consulate in Dubai. Consul General, thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you all this evening to a special program with three very distinguished panelists to talk about the US presidential elections taking place today. Now, this is a very unusual election, as you know, because it's taking place during a worldwide pandemic, and the pandemic has hit the United States particularly hard. And that means that this year, for the first time in memory, and probably the first time ever, more people will have voted before the actual election day today than will vote today. So we've now up to about 100 million Americans who have already voted, either by mail or by early voting. Still, the ones who are going out to vote today will make all the difference. This is a pretty close race. Americans are very enthusiastic and excited about it. We're expecting more voters to vote in this presidential election than any previous presidential election. The race is quite close, as you probably already know. In our system of elections for a president, what's really important is gaining a majority of electoral college votes, and that depends a lot on winning states. So just as 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the election because she lost in the Electoral College, same thing could possibly happen this year. Most polls and analysts think that Joe Biden will probably win the popular vote, but whether or not he will win enough states to win the Electoral College vote is still to be seen. The other thing to know about this election is that because so many people have voted early by mail, it's going to take a while to count all of those mail-in ballots. And that means that we may not know the result tomorrow morning as we normally would after a presidential election, but it may take several days for all the votes to be counted and for us to know exactly who the winner is. One thing I can say, and I think our panelists would concur, is that the country is very divided right now. You have people who are very pro-President Trump and people who are very pro-President Biden, or at least very anti-President Trump. And we are really divided along partisan lines. I personally don't think this election is going to heal that divide very quickly. It's going to take time, no matter who wins, to heal that divide. We are a very cleaved country at the moment. And I'm hoping personally that over the next 4 years, no matter who is elected, that Americans will be able to come together once again. So with that, Yasmin, I'll hand it back to you to introduce our very distinguished panel of analysts. Thanks.
Thank you, Consul General Frayne. Hello, everyone. My name is Yasmin Hebraoui, and I'm the head of the Public Affairs section here at the U.S. Consulate in Dubai. A little about our event tonight. The event is part of a month-long campaign designed by the U.S. mission to the UAE to help foreign audiences better understand the US elections and the electoral process. We are joined today by three distinguished panelists, as previously mentioned. I'm going to start by introducing them with Laura Marestani. She is the Associate Director for Constructive Politics at Democracy Fund, an independent foundation working to ensure that our political system is able to withstand new challenges and deliver on its promise to the American people. We also have Adam Remy, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science at NYU Abu Dhabi. He's a scholar of American politics, political methodology, and comparative legislative institutions. And finally, Vernon Peterson, who is the head of the College of Arts and Sciences Department of International Studies at the American University in Sharjah. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us virtually tonight, and I'll turn it over to them to explain a little bit about their background and expertise regarding US elections. And we'll start with Laura.
Hi, everybody. Good morning over here. Good afternoon over there. It's a pleasure to be able to join such a distinguished panel and the Department of State in this conversation today. So I lead the Constructive Politics program at Democracy Fund. Like Yasmin mentioned, we are an independent foundation trying to ensure and working to ensure that our political system is able to withstand new challenges and deliver on its promise to the American people. We do this by trying to strengthen and defend democracy through 3 core programs, a number of term-limited projects. We support partners and ideas from across the political spectrum in pursuit of a vibrant and diverse public square, free and fair elections, effective and accountable government, and a just and inclusive society. Our grantees right now are at the forefront of efforts to ensure that every vote is counted in the election, combat mis and disinformation, and ensuring a safe election across the country today, among many other roles that they are playing across the nation. So I look forward to the conversation about what promises to be one of the most interesting election seasons, because this is not going to be an election day, as the Council General alluded to, in history.
Thank you. Adam?
Hello, everybody, and I'm really excited to be joining this panel as well. Laura and Vernon, it's really an honor. This is actually my 3rd U.S. presidential election since having moved to Abu Dhabi in the summer of 2012, and it's one of the most interesting ones in my 8 years here. I'm a political scientist at NYU Abu Dhabi, and my research is on American politics. And most of what I just study is actually legislators and legislative behavior. But more broadly, I've been focusing in recent years on studying the personality traits of politicians and trying to understand what makes politicians tick. And on the voter side, trying to understand the personality traits that voters seek in their elected officials. I think that elections are something that have excited me ever since I was a kid. I remember being in middle school and getting excited learning about the electoral system. I remember seeing my fascination with maps starting in 7th or 8th grade, seeing electoral college maps and trying to understand the complexities of the American system and why it is the way it is and how it produces the outcomes that it does. And I think that the American system is one of the most interesting and unique ones in the world. It's not perfect. No system, I think, in the world is absolutely perfect. But I think that on days like this, Election Day, it's a really exciting time to sort of celebrate the American experiment in democracy and to sort of reflect on it, thinking about the last 4 years, but also the 4 to come. So I'm really excited to talk about this election in the context of American political history and in sort of thinking about the future. Because another part of what I do is actually statistical methodology, and so part of what I engage in is forecasting. And so looking at the polls and looking at public opinion data and trying to get a sense of all of this has been a mild obsession of mine that comes to a fruition today. So really excited to be together with all of you tonight and look forward to our conversation.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I want to thank the Public Affairs section at the Embassy for inviting me to speak. I've actually spent most of my career living abroad. Before coming to the UAE 6 years ago, I spent 9 years in Bulgaria. I teach American history. My research specialty is radical politics, in particular the Communist Party. So I've devoted a lot of my career to explaining the American political system to a foreign audience already. All of my students, every year that I teach American history, one of their #1 questions is always, why do you have an electoral college? What is the point of that thing? And I've developed a very good explanation over the years. I'll save that for later. Just some background on myself. I'm actually a resident of the state of Montana, which is one of the places where one of the key Senate races is taking place tonight, which could potentially decide the balance of power in the Senate. And also, my state is one of the states that benefits from the Electoral College. If the Electoral College went away, I don't think a presidential candidate would come within 1,000 miles of the state of Montana ever again. So I'm looking forward to hearing the questions, and I think it's going to be a great night.
Thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. And I'm going to start off with some questions, but I also encourage everyone who's watching tonight to type in your questions into the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can tonight. So my first question, that everybody wants to know is who's going to win? It's election day, and so the big question is, will it be a Trump or Biden presidency? And so I open that up to any of our panelists.
Well, let me start because 4 years ago in 2016, I very confidently told the audience at ION Dubai that we would absolutely see Hillary Clinton as president of the United States the very next day. So I'm less eager to make a prediction. In fact, the election could still go either way. But I'd like to bring up a fellow academic, Alan Lichtman, at the American University in Washington, D.C. Lichtman has a system for predicting presidential elections he calls presidential keys. And basically it's 13 factors. If you get enough trues, you're going to be president. Right now, he's calling the president for Biden. And I've got enough confidence in Lichtman to say that I think he's probably right.
I would just add, I think it's very close. And Adam and Vernon can talk to us a little bit about why that is, but just to kind of make a distinction, you know, for the past several elections, Democrats have won the popular vote. What they haven't been able to win is the Electoral College vote. And so right now, most of the predictions are that Biden would win the popular vote. But the question is, what states are each of the candidates able to win, and which one ultimately gets the number of Electoral College votes that they need to be able to win the presidency. So maybe Vernon and Adam, when they talk a little bit about how the Electoral College works, they can talk a little bit more about why that's the case, even though we have, you know, we would expect a pretty high popular votes for Biden in this election.
Yeah, I mean, I share the sentiment. This is a close race. I think that, you know, 4 years ago when I was asked this very same question, my answer at the time was that I thought Clinton would win, but I wouldn't bet the house on it. And my answer is very much the same today, perhaps a little bit stronger with respect to Vice President Biden's winning. I think that you know, as Laura was just mentioning, you know, the Electoral College creates a unique needle that needs to be threaded in the context of American politics. And so we can have these instances in which a candidate wins the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. It's happened twice in the last 20 years. It happened in the late 19th century a few times. And so I think we need to take that into consideration. And that's one of the reasons why this thing remains so close. I think that another factor why this election is so close is because of the unprecedented turnout that we've already seen, and I'm willing to bet that once the election day turnout numbers are released, that altogether we're going to see not just a large number of voters, a larger number than we've ever seen before, but I think that the voter turnout percentage is going to be higher than it was 4 years ago. And so whenever more people are involved in the process, it makes the situation all the more difficult to predict, because all the polls on the planet are predicated upon, you know, any poll that's worth its weight in gold at least is predicated on its ability to predict who's a likely voter and who's not a likely voter. And when you've got lots of new voters coming in, it's really hard to tell who, which way they're going to go. So again, too close to call, but I would say in the popular vote, lean Biden at this point. But other than that, I'm once again unwilling to bet the house.
Can I make a comment about why the Electoral College is not tracking with the popular vote anymore? It's actually only happened 4 times that the popular vote winner has lost the election. The first 2 times in the 19th century were because in 1824, we had 5 candidates running for president. So nobody got a majority, and it got thrown into, actually went past the Electoral College, went all the way down to the House of Representatives. It happened again in 1876, but that was because of contested votes in 3 southern states that were still occupied by the Union Army after the Civil War. And then it didn't happen at all until Bush versus Gore and Clinton versus Trump. And the reason that we're seeing it happen so often now in the 20th century is that, generally speaking, the Electoral College percentages track the population. But now that the population is concentrating so heavily in just a few states, you basically wind up nullifying millions and millions of votes, because it only takes 51% to get all the electoral votes for a given state. I did a little math prior, which was unusual for me because I became a historian because there is no math. But I did a little math before coming on the panel tonight. The 10 largest states in America outnumber all the other 40 by over 50 million votes. So the concentration has been really intense, but the very, very small states all still get 2 electoral votes for each senator, plus whatever they have for their representatives. It gives them a distinct edge.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is no one is betting the house on who's going to win. Generally, I think that's the consensus we have tonight. So all of you have mentioned the Electoral College. So I want to dig a little deeper into that in terms of, how are electors chosen, and, should the presidency be based on, I think, Vernon, you started talking about this as well, on the popular vote or the Electoral College? And finally, if the Electoral College can and should be abolished. That's also my other question, my last question.
Whether it can or it should be, it would be extremely difficult to abolish. It would require a constitutional amendment, which has to be ratified by 35 out of the 50 states. And as I commented earlier, the smaller states have a real stake in keeping it because it maintains their importance. So I'm not positive that we could generate enough votes to actually change the Constitution. Adam, I really defer to you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, incidentally, electors are themselves elected. That's one of the things. But I mean, so at the end of the day, the Electoral College is a vestige of a set of institutions that were designed in a way to reflect the nature of political realities in the late 18th century. And at the end of the day, I think the founding fathers had an image of the U.S. presidency in which the president was this sort of ceremonial figure who sat above politics, who would be a uniting figure of the nation, and who would represent sort of in a collective sense the collective will of the states. And so, and George Washington was kind of the archetype idea that in mind, and unsurprisingly, he was the first president of the United States, and he served 2 terms, set that tradition, which was not in the Constitution. They had to amend that later, and then go on from there. But of course, that's not how reality ended up shaking out in the end. And many states, initially, the electors were not chosen through democratic means. But ultimately, what happened over the course of the 19th century as the franchise expanded and as the country continued to evolve, states began to have popular votes for the president and then assign their electors the electoral votes that they are given for their states on the basis of who wins the popular vote at the state level. And so each state gets a number of electors equal to the number of senators that they have, plus the number of House members that they have. So every state has 2 senators, and every state has at least 1 House member. So the smallest number of electoral votes you can have is 3, like Wyoming or Vernon's beloved Montana. And then you've got, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got massive California in the 50s, and Texas, which is quickly catching up, not quite there yet, but it's growing at an increasingly rapid rate. And so you have these discrepancies between the popular vote and the Electoral College. Increasingly, Vernon talked about it already, but one of the other things that's kind of at the root here as well is the role of polarization, right? So one thing that the U.S. in the late 19th century had, which is the last time we saw this kind of split between the popular vote and the Electoral College, was massive regional and ideological polarization, where you had the South after the Civil War solidly Democratic and the northern states solidly Republican. And this led to sort of a disjuncture in the votes between the Electoral College itself and the popular vote. And we've seen something similar in recent years, though with the country's continuing growth in the Sun Belt and the South, these trends are starting to change. And so it's unclear where it's going from here. Whether it should be changed or not, I try to steer away from normative questions like that in my own research. I'm curious to hear what Laura's thoughts are on it. I think partly all I'll say about it is whether or not you think the Electoral College should change. I think it's largely a function as to what you think the presidency should be. If you think the president should be a popularly elected figure who represents the people of the country, then maybe the Electoral College seems like an anachronism that should change. But if rather you sort of cling to that traditional view that the president is sort of the collective leader of the various states that are these sort of semi-sovereign units, then the Electoral College makes a lot of sense. And so where you fall in that debate, I think largely will determine what your answer is to the question. But I'm curious what Laura's thoughts are.
Topic of polarization, right? Because Jasmine, the first thing that came to mind was exactly that this is one of the most divisive topics here in the US, you know, especially after the 2016 election, because the side that lost felt pretty adamant that we needed to do something about the Electoral College, while the winners who were favored are not in favor of doing anything about it. And so that's still a very divisive issue over here. One other thing I would add to this is that there are also other conversations around other avenues in terms of the structure of how our electoral system works. And so one of those is, you know, we also haven't revised for a long time the number of representatives that ultimately end up being those electors, right? Which are how many members of Congress each state gets to have. Not senators, we would still have 2. But after states undergo the census, which actually just happened this year, one of the things that needs to happen is that the states undergo redistricting. And in some cases, depending on the population, some of the states will gain more seats and some of the states will lose some seats. Part of what's going to be happening in the coming years is that redistricting process is going to happen, and that'll also kind of shuffle around where the number of electors live and in which states, depending on the population of those states. But then another question beyond what you do about the Electoral College is, should you consider increasing the allotted number? And for those who may not be as familiar, just getting a little wonky, there's 435 voting members of Congress, 441 if you count the territories, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Washington, D.C. And then there are 100 senators, 2 per state. And those, as Adam and Vernon were explaining, are the ones, that's the number that you're looking for tonight also in the coming election season to try to figure out who wins the Electoral College vote, right? So you need to be, those are the numbers that you're working from. So again, a lot of questions around the infrastructure of, you know, how the US elections process works. And what could be done moving into the future is still up for grabs, I think. And also, like I said at the beginning, a very polarized topic here in the US.
Yeah, I'd like to add.
Oh, sorry, go ahead,
Adam. Fine. You brought up the census, and the fact is, when we redistrict after this census, I think it's going to make the problem worse because the population has concentrated even more since the last census in 2010. So you're going to find even more disproportionate ratios between the large states and the smaller states out in the West and the Midwest.
Oh yeah, all I was going to say, just sort of tagging on all of that, is that there are, you know, so the Electoral College, the way that it works in 48 of the 50 states is that, and also the District of Columbia, though not a state, also gets 3 electoral votes. So the 48 states plus the District of Columbia assign their electoral votes to whoever gets the most votes in their state or in the district itself, with 2 exceptions. Nebraska and Maine assign their electoral votes at the state level whoever wins at the state level gets 2 of the electoral votes for their states, but then whoever wins the popular vote in the congressional districts within the state also wins an electoral vote for each district they win. So Trump lost the state of Maine in 2016, but he actually won Maine's 2nd congressional district. So he actually got 1 of Maine's electoral votes. And similarly, President Obama lost the state of Nebraska in 2008, but he won 1 of Nebraska's districts. And so he actually got 1 electoral vote from Nebraska back then. And so it's one tool that would not require a constitutional amendment to do away with the electoral vote, but would bring things closer toward parity, would be for all states to essentially assign their votes in this way, right? To not just say whoever wins, even by the tiniest margin, the vote at the state level gets all the electors, rather whoever wins the vote at the district level. It's not perfect because of things like gerrymandering, but it could get a little bit closer and would require no constitutional amendments, which of course makes the process a lot easier.
Yeah, I really have to agree with Adam on that. I think it would go a long way towards addressing the problem. And part of the reason is, though, you look at the Electoral College map, it gives you the impression that states are all 100% Republican or 100% Democrat. But if you look at it based on counties, every state is mixed. And even the brightest red states have pockets of Democratic voters. And the same thing in the solid Democratic state. There's solid representation from the other party. So I think it would help eliminate some of the bias in the winner-take-all system.
Thank you all. I want to switch a little bit to we mentioned how there's been historic voter turnout this year. And I'm curious to know if any of you thought about why that is this year, why we feel that people are much more motivated to vote early, to vote absentee, even ahead of today. And if you're seeing any early indicators from any of the key battleground or swing states.
So I can take a first stab at that. Obviously, we can't ignore the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic. And so that has obviously changed a little bit how we need to approach the actual process of elections. And so I think at the beginning this summer, there were a lot of states that were encouraging their citizens and were making changes to their systems. One thing to note is that the election process in the US is different on a state-by-state basis. So each state decides how they're gonna run their particular process, how they're, whether they're going to allow people to vote by mail or absentee, all of those things are decided at the state level. And so early on this summer, because of the pandemic, a lot of states tried to switch and make adjustments so that people had the ability to vote earlier in different ways. So there was a piece of it, a part of it was precisely to try to protect people in the middle of the pandemic. We also had a lot of concerns, right? Because there are actual people that need to be the poll workers that staff the polls for people to go vote. And a lot of those folks in years past are also people who are older, which, as we know, are at higher risk during the pandemic. So states also had to kind of focus on how they were going to try to shift things around to encourage younger people to serve as poll workers and to be able to staff a lot of those places during the election. So just taking some of the considerations that the pandemic brought into the mix, and that encouraged a lot of people to vote earlier. So I think that's one piece of it. I don't necessarily want to make assumptions in terms of the energy right now in the nation around this election. Maybe Vernon and Adam can speak to that, but there is a lot of energy this year for sure, and we are seeing it in the voter turnouts. So in some states, there has been over 100% voter turnout compared to 2016 in early voting. In other states, what we're seeing is, and there's also a partisan divide, something to be mindful of when you're looking at the numbers. So a lot of Democrats have voted earlier, and a lot of Republicans are expected to vote in person. And that is going to affect what you're seeing in the results And one of the reasons we are calling this an election season and not election day, because unlike other years, we may not have the results tonight. It could take several days. And so what you want to look out for as you're thinking about, you know, the first question that you posed, Jasmine, like who's going to win, is what votes are being counted first and where. So in some states, they start by counting those vote by mails or early voters, the early votes. In other states, they wait to count those last. And so obviously now that you know that there has been a partisan divide in terms of who has voted early and who hasn't, you can bet that if you're looking at a state that is counting vote in person ballots first, you may see that state leaning towards Trump. And then in other places where you have them counting vote by mail or absentee ballots first, you may see them leaning towards Biden. So just some of the things to kind of keep in mind as you look at the results and how you're reading the tea leaves tonight out of this election.
I actually take a slightly broader, more historic view towards the level of participation. It reminds me a lot of the levels of voter turnout in the late 19th century, and I think it's for the same reason. There was a lot at stake. The parties back then had very, very different stances, so who won really mattered. And this is the crucial part. The parties were very evenly matched in the late 19th century, so every election was a major struggle. And I believe the same thing is true here. You can argue back and forth how many of this kind, how many of that kind, but in terms, especially with the way the Electoral College works, the sides are very evenly matched. And this is really an election where I think every vote does count. So I'm actually kind of encouraged that people are getting out and taking it seriously.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of echoing what's already been said, I think voter turnout is largely a function of a couple of things. It's excitement expressed by voters about the election, and that could be either a satisfaction or a dissatisfaction with the status quo. It's the classic, as former President Ronald Reagan quipped, "Are you better in his challenging of Jimmy Carter? Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" And so in that same respect, I think that for voters on either side, it's that there's an energy either in favor of President Trump or opposed to him. But also, I think there's a perception that the election is close, and when people sense that elections are close and there's large stakes involved, they're much more likely to get engaged in the process. And I think sort of historically, if you look at voter turnout rates state by state, the states that are usually the swing states are the states that also tend to have much higher turnouts than the states that are states that are usually taken for granted. And I think what's happening is we've got states in this election that are expected to be closer than maybe they would have been 4 years ago or 8 years ago or what have you. And so places like Texas, which were not politically competitive for decades, are now competitive, and you're seeing voter turnout numbers in some of Texas' most populous counties exceeding as Laura already noted, exceeding what their turnout levels were in 2016. And I think that this level, it'll be exciting to see what the ultimate voter turnout numbers are. But I think that for either, because you think the election's close, or because you're excited about the 4 more years, or you don't want 4 more years, I think that combination of those 3 factors is really driving the turnout numbers up, which ultimately I think is good for American democracy.
Great, thanks everyone. I again want to encourage everyone who's watching to type in your questions. I see we have some questions in there. I'm going to ask one more question of the panelists before I turn to the questions. So you all mentioned swing states. So I want to go back to that and talk about, what are swing states, first of all, to our audience, those that are not aware. And also, question, are they the only states that matter, right? For instance, I'm from California, which is always blue. So would you say that my vote, quote unquote, counts less than a vote from, say, a swing state like Florida, right? So if anyone would like to comment on that, please go ahead.
Fine. Actually, I want to take a slight issue with your complaint about California, that it's always blue. It hasn't always been blue. And that's part of the answer. California used to vote Republican reliably. In fact, from its admission to the Union until 1912, it always voted Republican. It didn't start voting Democrat until Franklin Roosevelt was president, and then it switched back to Republican until 1992 when Bill Clinton came in. So in fact, the states will switch around. It just takes a little time because of inertia. And also, if you're voting, let's just say for the sake of argument, you're voting blue, California is always blue, why do we have to bother? If you don't bother, it'll turn red. So I completely disagree with your premise.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, this idea of swing states is, you know, the term you know, is somewhat self-explanatory. There are states that could very easily swing from supporting one party to the other from one election to the next. And you know, you know, Florida is like the quintessential example of this. You know, it's a party that no party has really won in a landslide for quite a while. It's you know, President Trump narrowly won it in 2016. President Obama narrowly won it in 2012. You know, it was of course the famous 2000 Bush versus Gore race with a very narrow margin, and the recount. That was, in fact, I was telling my students in my American politics class, that was that election, that was my senior year in high school. And so for me, that was like one of my first major political memories, was dimpled chads and hanging chads. And if you were around at that time, those terms will mean something to you. And you know, and just the uncertainty of the election, all because of Florida. And you know, but Vernon's also right in saying that, like, what's a swing state today might not be a swing state tomorrow. What's a reliable state one way today it might not be tomorrow. I mean, so in that same election, that 2000 Bush versus Gore election, George W. Bush did better in the vote, in his vote percentage in the state of Virginia, which is now pretty much a reliably Democratic state at the presidential level, than he did in West Virginia, which is a state that gave President Trump one of his best margins in 2016. George W. Bush narrowly won for West Virginia in 2000, but won comfortably in the state of Virginia. And then, of course, they switched tracks. So that, you know, what is a reliable state for one party today could be different tomorrow. And so I think that, you know, it's not. I don't think I think everybody's vote counts. And as Vernon said, you know, if everybody took the mentality that my vote doesn't matter, it could very easily lead to the election swinging the other way.
I don't want us to miss one important part of what is making current swing states, which is demographic change. And you brought California as a good example, right? And so in California, even after you know, Vernon mentioned in the 90s, they, at the presidential level, they switched towards more reliably blue. Still at the state and local level, you saw a little bit more Republicans winning in certain places up until in some areas, some Republican strongholds in the last midterm election turned blue in California. And that was a very interesting kind of dynamic, because a lot of those congressional districts had also their diversity had increased substantially. And so when you're looking at, you know, what the parties are saying and how many of them are trying to connect to those new voters and to the demographic composition of the state and actually respond to what the people in their states want, you're also kind of seeing those shifts between, you know, purple states, blue states, red states. And Florida is a perfect example of that. I actually, I'm very close to two of the primary communities that we're looking at in Florida, which is, I'm the daughter of Cuban refugees. Both my parents are Cuban refugees, and all of my family lives in Miami, my extended family. But I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, which is the other demographic that folks are now vying for, because as you may recall, or you may have heard, there has been a lot of Puerto Ricans that have moved to, the center part of Florida in recent years, and particularly after Maria, the hurricane that devastated the island. And what makes it a little bit purple right now is that we don't know those voters well. So we are not quite sure whether they will swing one way or another. We have some assumptions. But even the Cuban population, which has been solidly red for a long time, it varies by age. And it varies by kind of the refugee wave that they came into the country. So there's a little bit of uncertainty because those populations are new. And, part of the work that I've been leading at Democracy Fund is also around the fact that we do not invest currently in off-election years at the amount that we should in engaging those populations. And that's why we're so uncertain about how they're going to react and what it's gonna look like. Because a lot of the surge to focus on engaging diverse populations in the US happens during election years. And unfortunately, that doesn't provide us with those populations. And when you're looking at what else has been happening this year in the United States, which we also can't ignore. So beyond the pandemic, we have had massive protests across the country. And those protests the foundation of those protests has to do with this very issue, with how America is trying to live through its pluralistic values. So America's already diverse. And that's reflected in our entire conversation here, how states go one way or another. We're already diverse. What we haven't quite figured out is how do we navigate that diversity? How do we make sure that we are living our pluralistic values, that we are able to effectively engage all of those different people that make America as beautiful as it is? And so I don't want that point to be missed in the conversation, because it has a lot to do with this election. And it also has a lot to do with the comments that Adam was making in terms of like record polarization in the country and how all of that is playing into the election. And a lot of the other topics, Yasmin, that I know you want to get to in terms of, what's happening on the technological side of things. How are people engaging with this election? What does it mean? Why is there more energy? You can't leave those things in a silo. They have to do with the environment that we're living right now.
So I'm going to turn to the questions that we're getting. So a couple folks have asked about, should, Trump not accept the results that happen? And if there is not a peaceful transition, or what does that look like? Has this ever happened before? Is it possible that he may not vacate the White House?
I can just to make because I was kind of setting up the environmental factors that we're living in right now. In the United States, we have always held elections and upheld the results, even in times of great crisis. So we held successful presidential elections in the middle of the Civil War, the Great Depression, both world wars. And so we're fairly confident that our election system, our electoral system structure is set up to be able to mitigate this.
Yeah, I would simply agree with that. I actually think American institutions are definitely strong enough to manage. What's probably going to happen is that the result will be delayed even further because of court challenges in specific places about specific vote counting methods. But I really think in the end that if Donald Trump loses, he'll pack his bags and go back to Florida. Or maybe, as he suggested, perhaps he'll move somewhere else.
Yeah, I generally concur with all of what Laura and Vernon just said. I have been decidedly not alarmist, because that is just my nature as a scholar and as a person, and my modus operandi. That being said, there is of course the one time where an election happened that a part of the country didn't like, and of course the Civil War, the secession and the Civil War happened. I think that the odds of that are so slim that it's not worth thinking about. But it is there is that one time. But even in that election, that was not a case of somebody losing the election and then upstaging institutions. It was rather individual states being disappointed with the outcome as a consequence of the issue of slavery and so on. But I think almost certainly it's going to be the case that if President Trump were to lose, or Vice President Biden were to lose, that whoever would do it would sort of respect the democratic process. And in fact, I think this is one of the hallmarks of American democracy. There's a question, the very hotly contested question these days that I am not going to wade into of when did America become a democracy? But one of the arguments, that has been made historically is that it happened in 1800 because there was a peaceful transition of power from the Federalist Party under then President Adams, who lost the election, to President-elect Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. And so I think the peaceful transition of power from one political side to another is one of the hallmarks of our system. And I don't expect this election to be any different in that respect.
Although you bring up a really good case, and I think it has some application what we're looking at today. The Adams administration spent the entire lame duck period right up until the end of Adams' term at midnight, filling court appointments and doing everything they could to shore up all of their policies and make it harder for Jefferson to change anything. And I can certainly see that happening.
Beyond, placing the assumptions around what any candidate would or would not do, I think what's really important is to help individual voters have the right expectations around this election cycle, right? So a lot of the anxiety that exists right now has to do with the structure, like Vernon mentioned, whether our system is able to withstand some of the challenges that we have right now, increased voter turnout, unprecedented voter turnout, all great things. But what we're gonna have to really focus on is in having patience and making sure that throughout this process, the most important thing is that every single vote is counted. And so that's where we're gonna be looking at different states, and throughout the day today, we will be making sure that that's what's happening, right? That folks that show up to vote are able to vote, that votes are not thrown out. We've seen in certain states just with early voting efforts to disqualify ballots in certain cases. And so all of this is going to require some patience, because we're probably going to see an increase in terms of those challenges to whether votes were cast legally or not, what requirements are in place in different states. It's going to take us a little bit to count all of those votes, but that's step number one. And then step number two, obviously, will be around the transition of power piece of it, and that in the U.S. is not only whether candidates accept the results of the election, which, as we've said, has been the tradition. But also what happens during that period of transition, right? So if there is a transition of government, and that meaning if Biden should win, we also have to look at what happens with the agencies of government and how all of that is going to transition, and whether the Trump administration transfers all of the information that it needs to transfer. So that's one piece of it. The other thing that we're not talking enough about is this is not only a presidential election, right? So we are in the middle of several layers of elections. Members of Congress are all up for election every 2 years. So they're all up for election, all 435 plus the territories. And then there are several Senate races that are also key. And the Senate is really important to be looking at as well, because as you know, the Senate right now is held by the majority Republicans. And that has a big impact on what happens, whether Trump wins or whether Biden wins. So it's also important to be looking at what's happening at other layers, because it'll tell you a lot about what to expect in January when there is a transition or not.
So you mentioned something that one of our attendees has asked actually, is that, so we're talking to foreign audiences today, of course, so about US foreign policy. So should Biden Harris win, do we think there will be a dramatic shift in US foreign policy?
I think there'd be a shift in tone if Biden and Harris win. I think Biden will make an outreach back to our European allies. I think he'll rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. I think he'll seriously rethink the former agreement with Iran over nuclear proliferation. But at a more fundamental level, I have to say probably not. The United States has been slowly disengaging from its former very active, aggressive involvement in the world. We saw that under President Obama. It's certainly been more obvious under President Trump, but I think Biden will continue the trend. Yeah, I'd love it if you guys would disagree with me.
No, I generally agree. I think it's interesting that foreign policy played such a small role in this cycle. Now, part of that was a function of the fact that there were only 2 debates instead of 3. But usually, the tradition in the last several election cycles is that one of the debates is focused exclusively on foreign policy. And but I think that other than the aspects of foreign policy that directly touch on the pandemic or potentially issues related to international trade, on which, by the way, I think that the Biden administration would be more friendly toward international trade partners than the Trump administration has. But other than that, I don't see a huge difference in terms of other than in tone, in terms of their engagements. I don't see a more activist foreign policy in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world.
So I also want to shift gears again to talk about technology and sort of the role that technology has played in this election and in previous elections. Do we find that that has kind of been a game changer, whether it's social media or internet penetration? What comment do you guys have about that?
So one of the things that we'll be monitoring for during this election very closely is efforts to misinform or disinform communities, specifically around the election, or even some of the, most importantly, some of the issues we talked about today in terms of the process itself. So we've seen quite a few efforts already around misinforming voters. And it seems like, small things, but when you send out a tweet that seems like it's coming from a government agency telling you that the election, your polling place has been closed, or that that you should vote on another date, that reaches a lot of people through social. And so we're really monitoring those things and trying to figure out, how do we make sure that we put out accurate information. So for folks who are out there, what's really important is to verify anything that you see on social media before you retweet it, before you share it, because we tend to trust our friends a lot in that space. And in this election, you really have to make sure that you're getting accurate information out. The way that this is also kind of presenting itself, which we saw a little bit of during the protests and also during the past election, is in efforts to stoke division among communities. And so in the past election, we saw things like social media efforts citing opposing sides to show up at the same place for protest. That is something that we're looking out for, because we also are very worried that those misinformed efforts could contribute to creating unnecessary violence across the country. And so it's really important that people are mindful about what they're sharing, what they're not sharing, what they're reading, who is it coming from, what the source is.
Yeah, I think that technology is certainly reshape the way that Americans are engaging politics. I think in both, as Laura kind of already hinted at, in both good and bad ways. I think it's created decreased distance between Americans and their elected officials. You know, for again, not saying for better or worse, you know, the beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. But we've had a president for the last 4 years who engages in direct conversation with the American people on a daily basis through social media. And you know, it's a modern day, you know, 280 character, up to 280 character now version of a fireside chat. And you know, and not just President Trump. I mean, members of Congress, you know, and state legislators, governors, and local officials around the country use social media as a tool for connecting with people. It allows them direct access to converse with their representatives and governmental officials. And I think that's a good thing. It also allows them to sort of connect with fellow citizens, which especially in the time of a pandemic when people are trying to restrict their interactions with others. I mean, this technology that we're using today and connecting with each other from near and far, I think is great, but it also poses risks. And I think that we find ourselves in a world that's flooded with information that comes through at a speed so difficult, that's so fast that it's difficult to verify what's real and what isn't. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face today. And so on, you know, on the one hand, we have so much information at our fingertips that almost nothing is a mystery anymore. But at the same time, I think that in certain respects, I think the better angels of our nature are betrayed by some aspects of social media. And I think that polarization has got amplified through echo chambers, and particularly in the context of political division and discourse in the country. I hope it changes, and I think that there's definitely an increasing call for civility and for sort of harnessing these technologies for the better and for the common good, as opposed to for nefarious purposes. And so I hope that those movements continue going forward, no matter who's in the White House come January.
The only corrective I'd want to offer to this is I agree the technology has certainly speeded up communication. It's increased the amount of information out there, but the type of things we're talking about is the type of things we've always been talking about. This isn't the first election where people have just blatantly lied about the opposition or spread misinformation or tried to trick voters into turning up the wrong place. That's happened actually in the late 19th century. That was a really popular thing to do. It used to be you had to get it out of more old-fashioned media, newspapers, pamphlets, but these same kind of things were still out there. And the ability of presidents to better communicate with the American people has slowly evolved over the entire 20th century. Theodore Roosevelt was the guy who realized that he could make speeches and hold press conferences, and within days, everybody in the nation would know what he was talking about. Franklin Roosevelt stepped it up a little bit because he just got on the radio and was able to communicate directly. Trump's just taking it to another step. So I don't want to sound too much like your grandfather and say, oh, we've seen all this before, but in some ways we have. This is just a refinement.
Thank you, everyone. We're coming up at the end of our time together, but I did want to leave an opportunity for each of you to say any last words about, you know, this year's elections, about the hyperpartisanship, or, you know, whatever it is that, you know, you want to communicate to audiences here.
I could take a stab. I think Adam and the Council General made a really good point at the beginning that we should recall before we go about the rest of our day or night, which is, regardless of what happens, a lot of what we Americans are gonna have to really engage with moving forward is in unifying our country. So regardless of the who wins the presidential election, we really are going to have to focus on how do we make it so we can decrease polarization, because a lot of these other forces that we are discussing here today are playing into how this election will pan out, have to do with the fact that America is very polarized at the moment. And not to say that we haven't been in years past, we have many times over, but this time is a little bit different in that even in the way that the technology functions, it really amplifies those divisions and is really hitting at structural issues in our country that we're going to have to reckon with. And so I think that that's something not to lose sight of in this process. And then the final thing is, again, I'll say be patient. In fact, this is the time, if you want to sit home and make all of those predictions and play with your friends and family, go ahead and do that, because it's probably going to take us a little bit to figure it out, but we will have a result eventually.
Following up on what Laura's had to say, I agree. The biggest problem we're facing is severe division. And the part that bothers me personally the most is that we've come to the point where we start demonizing our opponents. They're not just, we just don't disagree with them, they're absolutely morally bankrupt. One of the symptoms of this is the bandying about of extremist terms. The other day, someone referred to Kamala Harris as a communist. She's not a communist. And other people have referred to Donald Trump as a fascist. No, he's not. He's a populist. He's not a fascist. I think we need to step back from the use of extreme terms and actually make a genuine attempt to see the point of view of the other parties. I kind of have to do that a lot myself because I'm pretty much a liberal living in the heart of Trump country out in Montana, and I don't want to unduly anger my neighbors, and I grew up with these people, so it's important to try and understand the point of view they're coming from.
Yeah, it's just sort of piggybacking off of that. I think that, for me, I since moving to the UAE 8 years ago, I have a tradition of staying up all night on election night because the results don't start to come in until the wee hours of the morning in Abu Dhabi. And there's another day. There's only one other day that I do that for, and that's for the U.S. Super Bowl, which also is in the wee hours of the morning in Abu Dhabi. And I think the Super Bowl for me, I tell my students, I tell this to my wife who thinks I'm crazy for doing this. I tell her that that these things, and I think that for me that analogy makes perfect sense. Because just like in the Super Bowl, which is the culmination of the American football season, you have two teams going against each other, each with their supporters who are diehard fans and hope that their side wins. But regardless of who wins, there's nevertheless this sort of national coming together where everybody around the country is sitting around eating chicken wings, watching and laughing at the same ridiculous commercials, and sort of engaging in this event that's part of our national culture. And so, it's less about who wins and more about sort of celebrating what it means to be American. And I think Election Day is in many respects that same sort of thing, where regardless of whether you think that President Trump's policies or Vice President Biden's policies are the right way for it to go for the nation, I think that we should all come together and celebrate on this day, this big sort of feature of our democratic system. Again, support each other in that, and that involves both participating in the system, but also trying to, as Vernon said, trying to understand your neighbors, regardless of whether you agree with them or not. And so, I don't think I have ever lived in a place where a majority of the people around me have shared my own political views around something, and I actually think that that's a wonderful thing, because I think it's enriched me as a person, and it's helped me to develop my ideas and my beliefs and understand where other people are coming from as well. So for all of my fellow Americans who are out there in the audience, be you expats here in the UAE or wherever you are, happy election day to you. And for those of you who are trying to make sense of the system, I hope that we helped you even the littlest bit tonight.
Thank you everyone for those final words. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience tonight. I know I learned a lot. I get the sense from the comments that our audience learned a lot. So thank you and good night.